let's talk about Titus Groan by Mervyn Peake, which is the first book in the Gormenghast Trilogy or Tetralogy, depending on how far you accept the fourth volume. This is a gothic-y, semi-darkly comic fantasy about a vast mansion city, stately home city. You know, some estimates seem to suggest you've got a population the size of a city there, and is ruled by the House of Groan. And the 76th Earl of Groan, Sepulchrave, has had a son at last, Titus, who will therefore be the next Earl of Groan. And Titus Groan is not mostly about Titus. Titus is a baby in it, and it's about the first year or so of his life. And he's important at many points, but it is about the importance of Titus to Gormenghast, this great city, palace, stately home. Quickly, the trilogy consists of Titus Groan, Gormenghast, Titus Alone, which is the third and final book by the author, written a bit after the other two, while struggling with ill health. And then there is a fourth book. It's complex. Basically, his widow, Mervyn Peake's widow, wrote a book, which was, I think, recognised as a working out of grief, a completion of a story that was important to her husband, but she never attempted to publish it, and I'm sure she could have. It was published after her death, I think, or at least very, very late, as it is published by her son, which is, I think most people, my channel regular parameters certainly think so, just doesn't count. So you've got these three books, and they are well liked, well considered. The first two tend to be considered very, very, very good by most fantasy aficionados who have read them, and the third book is well liked. I think actually quite a few people think it's really good. Some people think it's a step down. Yes, we read this in my slow burn buddy read group on the Discord, and it was fun. It was good. It is one of the most atmospheric and moving and touching and generally environmental books you will ever read. As in, it's probably a top three in that kind of category for me. Peake is a rich and voluptuous stylist. He is incredibly big on quite efficient description in some respects. So not on a kind of vast 12-page descriptions, but on a kind of really capturing things, but with a lot of texture, a lot of wit and sharpness. He is also a world-leading, really caricaturist. He is excellent at drawing caricatures of characters, saying this is this character, look at this weird way they look and the weird way they act. The imaginative world is top-notch, fascinating, confusing, begs many questions, requires more questions than it answers, as it were. Yes, it was an enjoyable read. I enjoyed it a lot. I enjoyed talking about it. I found some things really spectacularly moving. You know, Peake obviously was a writer of real talent. I think there are a couple of big things I ran into, which I'll address. I'll talk about these critiques as I sort of maybe expand a bit and try to say a bit more about what I enjoyed alongside them. So the biggest one is basically about pacing. So I'm saying he's quite efficient at description. He's very good with drawing these characters and saying, this is this weird thing. But essentially there's a massive problem with the fact that the first quarter is quite slow, but it feels like it's building stuff up, and then it gets going. In the second quarter, I mean, maybe I'd divide these very slightly differently, but roughly the second quarter is quite pacey. Lots of things happen. It's really interesting. And the final quarter, or whatever it might be, the final fifth, is really good too. It's really pacey. It's very powerful. It's dramatic. There are some incredible tableau and setups, and he's just hitting all of these. He's just punching hard all the way at the end. But the third quarter, much like the first quarter, but much worse, is very slow. Very little happens, and what that means is half the book there's not really very much plot. There are a few hints at plot, but you're talking about in a 300-page book, maybe I think it's a 300-page book. 360-page book. You're talking about probably 150 to 180 pages where you're in there for the vibes. Some people are really into that, but I think it's everyone who read this, the entire group, in terms of who gave detailed comments at least, really did conclude this, that you had a genuine issue with pace. I think some people still thought, man, this is such an amazing book, nearly perfect. Apart from that, some of us were more skeptical. Everyone also enjoyed it in general, but it really was a struggle in that section to have hope that this was going to conclude. And one thing is that it doesn't entirely, because it concludes an arc of the story, setting up Titus's main story of his childhood and early adulthood in Gormenghast. This is, in a sense, is almost acting as a prequel. But that does mean that what you're looking at is, there is, in one sense, a set of satisfying conclusions, and there are, but in another, and some really interesting conclusions, but in another sense, and more materially as to the kind of plot, it doesn't fully resolve. You are going to have to read the next book to get it, and that's fine. I mean, you read The Eye of the World, and there's another 13 books or whatever it is, 14 books. That's fine. There's no point in complaining about it. That's just a series. It's the nature of a series. But my point here is that you've pushed through the section, come to the fairly explosive, satisfying conclusion, but you realise that it's satisfying on its own terms, but doesn't give you much else. And this is a shame, because this is what really this is the big demerit. There's a second kind of demerit as well I'll pick up. This is a shame, because the basic ideas of the plot, which is this kind of weird, ornate, bizarre place with weird, bizarre rituals, weird, bizarre people, essentially has to deal with a few things going on at once. And one is the idea of the transition from father to son, the continued line of the House of Groan. But then there are a couple of impingements upon this. One is a wet nurse for Titus called Cada, who has a very strange, confusing, and it does resolve. It's actually a very, very powerfully resolved arc in every sense, but very strange, separate plot. But she comes from this weird place just on the outside of the main walls of Gormenghast called the Mud Huts. And yeah, she's an impingement, but the bigger impingement is someone presumably from within Gormenghast, because if it has such a vast population, I guess people just born and raised there. There's a really weird thing when you realise, there are other people outside in the world. When someone goes elsewhere for a while, and I think it does come up later in the series, but when someone goes elsewhere for a while, they meet other people. They're like, there are obviously other people out there many miles away from Gormenghast, but it is a world to itself. But this other intruder is not an intruder into Gormenghast, but is, if you like, more tumorous within Gormenghast, is a self-developed curse, and that's Steerpike, who's a kitchen boy who has a very Nietzschean take on things, in both the philosophical and the Andromeda sense. He just wants to take. He deserves it. He's going to take it. He's very clever, and his interference in family affairs and his kind of unveiling himself into family affairs is the inciting incident, really, more than Titus's birth in this first book. So you have these things working together, and it's very interesting, and the things that happen are very interesting. But between a kind of elapsing into environmentals, too many environmentals for most of us, occasional just repetition or not quite sort of finishing off a point and moving on, and a few other things like that, just to do with the structure and pacing. This quite interesting plot about the threat to the ancient tradition and edifice of Gormenghast somewhat falls apart at a pacing level. The other, I'll put it as a demerit, and then this actually, whereas with the plot, I think it is more of a burden at points than it is a benefit. With characters, I think characters are more of a benefit than they are a burden, but there is an issue, there is a problem to do with being repelled by quite a lot of the characters. It is a grotesque world. It's a Goya painting of a world. I think it's interesting to The illustrations in this, which are sparse, are by Peake himself. I'll see if I can find one. There are basically not millions, which obviously makes it slightly harder to tell. But he was an illustrator by trade, and you can see this kind of quite sharp, shadowy, slightly grotesque, disproportionate face, and so on. And that's just common. People look weird. People act weird. His noting their tics is incredibly common. And I get to this, though he does give a lot more nuance than you'd expect, what this means a lot of the time is you're just dealing with people like, I just feel uncomfortable around these people. I mean, this is just sad. And some people like that, but I guess, again, I say this about in related context, I don't feel like I need that in my life. I don't feel like I'm gaining catharsis from it, and I don't think I'm being edified by it. And so I read it and I think, these people are a bit squicky, aren't they? And this is partly a result of how skilled he is at the caricature, both the cartoon caricature, but also the written caricature of these characters who are strange freaks. Now, there is a caveat to that, and as I say, this is why character, because that might sound like a more damning indictment than the plot. Well, the plot at least satisfied well, but surely the characters were just dreadful. Is that he early on gives a few characters who you can kind of engage with. I'm thinking very early on, Fuchsia, Titus's older sister, daughter to the Earl and Countess of Groan, and Fuchsia, there's enough self-reflectiveness and ability to think about things and enough sort of healthy desire, because that's a big thing, is how much Gormenghast perverts desire. It's seemingly how far things go out of the norm is exceptionally common. There are other characters too who you begin to realise there is something else to them, and I don't want to kind of give that away. But there are other heroes or heroic characters whose heroism is hidden initially behind what you see, and that's interesting in a way because there's a degree to which Peake has these unimpressive characters initially, or unattractive characters, become attractive, and that's all to the good. You have to wrestle and struggle through things where I think it is alienating and over alienating, I'd argue, but I think you get to a point where you realise that yes, there's a subtle array of characters, none of whom are perfect, some of whom may be villainous, but where there are people you can root for, there are people you want to see more of. That's a big thing, especially because there's an interesting mix of point of view stuff. It's third person, but often dropping into a third person omniscient, often dropping into third person limited, or partial limited, and you see a lot from people's perspectives, and as you gradually pick this up, you want to spend more time with certain characters. And you want certain people to succeed, and there are a lot of the big successes and the big oofs are about that kind of thing. So yeah, I think Titus Groan is a good book. I haven't read the rest of the trilogy. I want to. I didn't think it was an absolute all-time great book. It's kind of complicated because it's often seen as an all-time great book, and you've got to, when the general view is something is an all-time great book and you simply think, well, I don't like it, I didn't get it, you should probably question yourself, okay, what was it that people like and what didn't I like? Where's the clash? Where's the gap in expectation? And I think this is so clearly an aesthetic achievement of an incredibly high order, at just the pure level of being beautifully written. The light that seeped in a dull haze through the window dragged out as from a black canvas the main bone formation of Mr. Flay's head, leaving the eye sockets, the hair and area beneath the nose and lower lip, and everything that lay beneath the chin as part of the night itself. It was a mask that hung in the darkness. That sort of thing. This incredibly powerful prose, and incredibly powerful caricature there of Flay in the darkness and the shadow. people, I think that's something where a flawed artist correctly, reasonably gets more attention because of some great strength. But as an all-round book, for me, it lacked something, because in the end, as I say, I found it hard to root for people often. That got better. I found that the structure just didn't work at all, really. And though there was a satisfying conclusion, the payoff, because the fact it's part of what was originally functionally, I think, at least a two-part book, really, by Titus Groan and Gormenghast. Because of that, there is a problem where you are having to put up with a classic finishing book one of a long series kind of thing, where you're like, okay, so I can't have the big stuff pay off. You're left with small things and that's okay. I like series, but after the structure, that's a problem. I would recommend it to people who like, Neil Gaiman. I think it's an influence, obviously, on people like Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, actually, as well. I would recommend it to those people. I think if you like the macabre and grotesque side of Dickens, you'll like it. It's certainly influenced by Dickens. I think I suspect if you like something like 100 Years of Solitude, I recommend on this channel, or I gather of it, I own it, I haven't read it yet, Little Big by John Crowley, you'll like this. So if you have read it or read the trilogy or whatever, tell me what you think in the comments, and I will see you next time.